Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we're going to do some exercises with regard to the credibility of claims and sources. Just a kind of application of those concepts a bit. Okay, so the first kind of exercise we're going to cover is how you judge and what kind of claims are credible and why we should think they are or they aren't. Okay? So the first claim that I've got here to consider is the center of the earth is water, right? And for me, when I see a claim like that, right, it's a claim that conflicts with all that I know about the way this planet operates and works, right? And it's a claim that conflicts with everything that science says about this planet. And so, what I would do here with a claim like this is just obviously investigate what the science says. To me, this seems to lack credibility based upon that. The next claim is that ghosts exist, right? Now, again, what I do here with a claim like this is I look to investigate it, right? What would be the reasons for and against believing something like this? What's actually interesting about this kind of claim is that a lot of people actually do believe it. It's actually something that I think a lot of people do and a lot of people don't believe, right? And maybe there's more reasons in favor of it than you might think, right? So I think, again, here is a claim that's maybe a little more credible than the first one about the earth. And it's a claim that we want to do some investigation about. I know with regard to the existence of ghosts, there are a lot of television shows now that actually, aim to prove by way of scientific means that ghosts are real. So it is an interesting question. I think this one certainly has more credibility than the first claim about the earth and the center of it being water. So the next claim, it says a diet of mushrooms and pecans supplies all necessary nutrients for you to live and you will lose weight, but scientists don't know why this is the case. To me, when I hear this kind of claim, it's really interesting. I mean, kind of seems like that would be a diet that somebody would try. I don't really understand why for me on this one, scientists wouldn't be able to explain that. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But nevertheless, I think, again, when I was exploring a claim like this and whether this was a credible claim or not, I would just try to look to the science here as an explanation. So the last claim is the tallest human being to ever live was 16 feet 9 inches tall, right? To me, when I hear that claim, it strikes me as immediately as false. And the reason is because, most human beings are anywhere between 5 and, 7 feet tall or something like that. So I just couldn't see, anyone being anywhere close to, close to that tall. But again, for research purposes, to determine if a claim like that was actually true, I'd probably look in something like the Guinness, what is it called? The Guinness Book of World Records or something like this. A book like that, an encyclopedia maybe, something like this where we could probably very quickly determine if that was true or false. So the next set of exercises here is just an exercise where you have a kind of situation or an event or a claim, and then you have several different sources related to that claim, and then you're supposed to try to understand which sources would be more or less credible and more or less biased, right, regarding the claim. So the first example, it says, judging the relative performance of the fighters in a heavyweight boxing match. And the first source regarding that boxing match is the father of one of the fighters. Now, of course, you can imagine the father of one of them, each of the fathers being extremely biased, obviously. And so that would be someone that you really wouldn't want to, the opinion wouldn't really be something that we would hold a lot of value in, and somebody that we would consider to be pretty biased on that matter and not really having a lot of credibility, right? The next example is the coach of the American Olympic boxing team. So for me, when I think about something like that, the only thing I could see is a bias coming in where if there was an American fighter and one of the fighters wasn't American, I could see that being a kind of bias, like having a bias toward the American boxer as opposed to the other one. But you can imagine the coach being knowledgeable certainly about the heavyweight boxing match. You just wonder whether he'd have any biases involved. That'd probably be the only worry there with that one. The next example, it says a writer for Sports Illustrated. Again, my question about a source like that would be how knowledgeable are they about boxing in particular and heavyweight boxing and the particular fighters and so on. It seems like they would probably be objective unless, for example, Sports Illustrated was doing a story on one of the boxers and not the other. That might be a worry there. Okay, well, the second example here, it says is you are trying to decide if you should buy a Mac or a PC computer. And the first source related here is a friend who owns a PC. Now, of course, if you have a friend owning a PC and not a Mac, then that friend will likely have a bias toward PCs. And so that really wouldn't be an objective, unbiased kind of source. And then, of course, our next example, it says a dealer for Mac computers. There's going to be also probably a huge bias there as well, right? Because that person in particular has even more of a bias involved because they're trying to sell the Mac computers. So of course the bias is much stronger there, right, to get you to buy one. The next example, it says reviews in computer magazines. That's probably a pretty neutral kind of source, unless of course you might have kind of an advertising bias involved with some of these magazines, like say that Macs were giving money to advertise in their magazine. That might be a worry there. But usually in computer magazines that are credible, they do a kind of objective, neutral review of the products of the computers they're reviewing. So that's probably a pretty good source. The next example is the mechanical condition of the used car you are trying to buy. And the first source in consideration is the salesman at the used car dealership, right? Obviously, that's probably a really, really extremely biased source, right? Of course, he's trying to sell you that car, so there's a heavy bias there, right? The next example, it says the mechanic at the used car dealership. And again, it's the same car dealership you're trying to buy it from. The mechanic there is obviously going to likely be biased toward that vehicle as well. So that's probably not a very objective source either. The last example here, it says a mechanic from an independent garage. Probably a better source here, right? Because the mechanic in this case doesn't have the bias of being located at that car dealer where it's being sold, and so they have a more objective, neutral stance with regard to the car, right? What does it really look like, I think that's probably the source you would want to trust there. Okay, so the last kind of question here, it says for the following examples, say which sources are biased and which are not, right? And so the first example here, it says, it says, say you are thinking of purchasing a new television, which sources are biased, right? So the first example, it says a flyer from a local store that sells televisions. Well, of course, a flyer from a store that sells televisions, that store is going to be interested in selling the televisions that they offer, right? And it's going to be interested in probably selling the televisions that they get and can make the most profit from selling. So that's going to be an extremely biased source there. What about then source number 2, the Consumer Reports website? Consumer Reports, in my opinion, is a pretty neutral, objective source. They tend to do a kind of unopinionated review of products, and I tend to trust that one. I think in particular because advertising doesn't really impact them. It's just people subscribing to their website, and they tend to test out products pretty well without having much of the bias involved. So that would be a good one. What about a salesperson at a local electronics store? Again, obviously, when you're talking about any kind of salesperson, they're trying to get you to buy a product, so there's a heavy bias there for that, and so you want to be weary about trusting someone like that. The fourth example of a source here, it says an article in a major newspaper about televisions, including some ranking of brands. This kind of sounds like more of an objective, neutral source to me. If you've got this kind of ranking of brands, if you've got kind of an objective, ranking going on, a kind of pros and cons list of the televisions that you might buy, then it's likely going to be something that is objective. I will say that again with newspapers, they do make money off of advertisements, so you would worry maybe about the possibility of a bias coming in through an advertiser. But other than that, it's probably a pretty objective source. So, okay, well that is it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.